What happened after the black general picked up his phone left the court speechless. The general walked into the courtroom without a single word, and yet his presence carried more weight than all the chatter filling the air. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, wearing a simple, neat suit that did nothing to hide the years of discipline etched into his frame. There was no flashiness about him, no exaggerated attempt to draw attention, and yet people couldn't help but glance in his direction. Some stared longer than others, wondering who he was, while others looked him over quickly before dismissing him as just another man caught up in the proceedings. He didn't sit in the front rows, didn't ask for anyone's attention, but the way he carried himself made him stand out in a room where everyone else fidgeted nervously or tried too hard to look confident. When he sat down, his posture was impeccable. Back straight, shoulders squared, his hands folded calmly in his lap. His eyes, sharp and observant, scanned the courtroom without any sign of judgment or irritation. It was as if he had been in places far more intense than this, and the tension hanging in the room was nothing compared to the storms he had already weathered. Some noticed the faint streaks of gray in his hair, the disciplined calm of his movements, and thought he looked like a man who had seen too much yet never allowed the weight of it to break him. Around him, the atmosphere was buzzing with whispers and sideways glances. A few people smirked, a few others exchanged hushed words, not realizing or not caring that he could hear them. They saw only what they wanted to see, an older black man sitting silently, with no lawyer whispering in his ear, no group of people surrounding him, no signs of wealth or status on display. To them, he looked like someone ordinary, someone powerless in the face of a system built to dismiss men like him. They couldn't see the years of service, the countless battles fought, the sacrifices made, the authority carried in the way he held his silence. Even the judge, glancing briefly toward him, seemed to place him in a mental box and move on, as if his presence didn't deserve more than a passing thought. But if one had looked closer, if one had studied the slight tightening of his jaw or the measured breaths he took, they would have realized that this was no ordinary man. This was someone who had spent a lifetime commanding respect without needing to demand it. His calmness wasn't weakness, it was the steady strength of a man who had no need to prove himself to anyone in the room. The bailiff, walking past, paused for half a second when their eyes met. There was something in the general's gaze, something steady and unwavering, that made the man look away quickly. He couldn't explain it, but it was as if he had locked eyes with someone who could see straight through him. Others didn't notice this subtle exchange, but the few who did felt a ripple of unease. They couldn't quite put a name to it, but they knew they were in the presence of someone who didn't belong to the ordinary world of petty courtroom dramas. Yet, despite the way he naturally drew attention, the general didn't flinch when others underestimated him. He didn't shift in his seat or react to the whispers. He didn't lean over to explain himself or reveal who he really was. His silence was deliberate, almost strategic. He was content to let people think what they wanted, to let their arrogance blind them. He knew something they didn't, and that knowledge allowed him to sit there, unmoved by their shallow judgments. Every movement he made was precise. When he adjusted his tie, it wasn't out of nervousness, but out of habit, the ingrained discipline of a man who had lived by order and precision. When he glanced at the clock on the wall, it wasn't impatience, but calculation. His presence alone sent a quiet message, though few were wise enough to hear it: he wasn't here to play their games. He wasn't here to beg for understanding. He was here because he chose to be, and that choice carried weight. The atmosphere around him began to shift subtly. People who initially smirked or ignored him found themselves sneaking glances more often, as if trying to figure out what exactly set him apart. There was something unsettling about his composure, the way he didn't seem rattled by the mockery or the slow-moving proceedings. Even those who laughed under their breath began to feel the edges of that laughter fade. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something about this man, something important. Though he hadn't said a single word, his calm presence was speaking louder than anyone realized. It was the kind of silence that filled the room with questions people didn't even know they wanted to ask. It was the kind of presence that carried authority not granted by a courtroom, but earned through years of sacrifice and service. And while others saw just a man waiting for his turn to speak, the truth was that the entire courtroom was already being reshaped by the weight of the general's presence, long before he ever picked up the phone. The whispers that had begun as small murmurs slowly grew into something sharper, something edged with mockery. People in the courtroom leaned toward one another, speaking in tones that were just low enough to disguise the words but loud enough to be heard by the man sitting silently at the center of it all. Some smirked openly, their glances bouncing off him as if he were invisible, while others chuckled under their breath as though they were sharing a private joke. It wasn't his posture or his silence that provoked them, it was the assumptions they had already formed in their minds. They looked at his skin, at the lines of age on his face, at the absence of anyone by his side, and decided they knew his story before it was ever told. To them, he was simply a man out of place, a man standing on unfamiliar ground with no allies to call his own. One young attorney, barely out of law school, leaned back in his chair and muttered something to his colleague, his eyes flicking toward the general before both men laughed quietly. Their laughter wasn't loud, but it carried, and the sting of it was deliberate. A few others joined in, feeding off the unspoken agreement that mocking him was safe, that there would be no consequences for underestimating someone they assumed to be powerless. In their eyes, he was just another defendant or witness without influence, someone who could be ridiculed without repercussion. Even the opposing counsel, a man with a reputation for arrogance, smiled smugly when he glanced his way. It wasn't a smile of warmth but one of superiority, as if he had already won whatever battle was set to play out in the courtroom that day. He tapped his pen against the table, his expression dripping with the kind of confidence that came not from truth, but from the assumption that his opponent was weak. The general, however, remained still, his expression unchanging, refusing to rise to the bait of their mockery. From the gallery, there were whispers colored with judgment, remarks about how he looked, about why he was even there. Some wondered aloud why a man like him would dare to sit in silence without a defense team swarming around him. Others speculated about his finances, his background, even his intelligence, laughing softly at the conclusions they drew from nothing more than the color of his skin and the calmness of his demeanor. Every word, every laugh, every sneer was built on a foundation of arrogance and ignorance. The judge, though not openly mocking, carried himself with a kind of dismissiveness that wasn't much better. His eyes barely lingered when they passed over the general, as if he wasn't worth more than a passing glance. His tone, sharp with others, softened only slightly when addressing him, but not out of respect, out of that patronizing patience one uses with someone they've already decided is beneath them. It was an underestimation so deeply ingrained that it seemed natural, unchallenged by anyone else in the room. The bailiff, too, seemed to take cues from the atmosphere, his movements around the general tinged with an air of casual disregard. He didn't offer the same courtesies extended to others, didn't treat him with the same small gestures of deference. To the bailiff, he was just another ordinary man to be ushered in and out, another case in a long day of cases, nothing worth remembering. Despite the growing air of mockery, the general never shifted in his seat. He didn't frown, didn't scowl, didn't return the disdain with even a flicker of reaction. His silence became an easy target, a blank canvas upon which others painted their arrogant assumptions. They mistook his calm for weakness, his patience for submission. They believed that because he hadn't risen to defend himself, there was nothing to defend. The younger men in the gallery nudged one another, whispering jokes that sparked laughter, their eyes always sliding back toward him as though waiting for a reaction that never came. The absence of that reaction only fueled their arrogance, as though his refusal to engage confirmed their suspicions. To them, he wasn't a man with history or authority, he was a man stripped of identity by their own prejudice. Every word spoken, every smirk shared, was built on the illusion of superiority. They could not see beyond what they assumed, could not imagine that the man they mocked had once walked in rooms where their names held no weight, where their arrogance would have crumbled under the weight of true authority. They didn't recognize the discipline in his stillness, the strength behind his silence. To them, he was already defeated before he had even spoken. The courtroom became a stage for their underestimation. Each chuckle, each whispered comment, each dismissive glance layered insult upon insult, not realizing that every assumption they made was a miscalculation. They believed they were looking at a man powerless in the face of the system, when in truth, they were looking at someone who had lived a life commanding systems far greater than anything within those four walls. The room had been filled with low laughter and whispers, but the atmosphere shifted the instant the general reached for his phone. It wasn't a rushed movement, not the panicked fumbling of someone desperate to prove a point, but a calm and deliberate action. His hand slid into his pocket with precision, pulling out the phone as though it were just another tool in his arsenal, something he had carried countless times before and used with the same quiet confidence. People who had been smirking only a moment earlier now paused, their attention unconsciously drawn to the simple act of a man lifting a device everyone else in the room owned, yet somehow, in his hands, it seemed to carry a different weight. The general didn't glance around to check who was watching him. He didn't announce what he was about to do. He simply sat in his chair, back straight, shoulders squared, and pressed the phone against his ear with the composure of someone entirely in control. The faint sound of a dial tone carried just enough for the silence around him to feel heavier. It was no ordinary call, it was the type of call made by someone who knew that the person on the other end would answer immediately, without hesitation, and without questions. A hush spread through the courtroom, almost instinctively. People leaned slightly forward, curiosity fighting with the arrogance they had held just minutes before. Some expected it to be a bluff, a call for show, maybe even a plea to a friend or family member who could do nothing to change the situation. They smirked again, waiting for the moment when his attempt at authority would collapse under the weight of reality. But the general's face betrayed nothing. His expression was unreadable, his tone measured and low, each word spoken with the clarity of command rather than the desperation of a man backed into a corner. The judge shifted slightly in his seat, eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge what exactly was happening. Judges had seen theatrics before, they had watched people make calls in a last-ditch effort to stall proceedings or to pull in some external support that never materialized. But there was something different here, something unsettling in the way the general spoke into the phone. His words weren't hurried, they weren't cluttered with explanations or excuses, they were concise, as though he were delivering orders to someone who already understood the weight behind them. Opposing counsel chuckled quietly, attempting to mask his unease with arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, expecting to hear the general beg for help. But when a response came from the other end of the line, though too low for anyone else to hear, the shift in the general's eyes said everything. It wasn't the look of a man asking for a favor. It was the look of a man setting something in motion. His words that followed carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent a lifetime giving instructions that were followed without question. In the gallery, the whispers returned, but this time they weren't filled with mockery. They were sharp with confusion, threaded with unease. Who was he calling? Why did he sound so calm? Why did he speak like someone accustomed to being obeyed, rather than someone pleading for a lifeline? People who had dismissed him minutes earlier found themselves watching closely, their smirks fading into tight expressions of curiosity they couldn't disguise. Even the bailiff, who had earlier treated him with casual disregard, shifted uncomfortably in place. He had seen countless defendants and witnesses make phone calls, some shouting into their devices, some crying, some promising things they couldn't deliver. But this was different. This man wasn't begging, wasn't bargaining, he was commanding. It didn't sound like a call for help, it sounded like a call to confirm something already prepared. The opposing lawyer tapped his pen nervously against the desk, the smugness in his expression thinning. The more the general spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't a meaningless performance. The measured pauses, the certainty in his tone, the way he never once wavered in his posture, everything about it radiated authority. It wasn't the voice of a man who hoped to be heard, it was the voice of a man who expected obedience. Some in the audience began to exchange uneasy glances, though no one dared to say anything out loud. The arrogance that had filled the room minutes earlier was beginning to crumble, chipped away not by shouting or theatrics, but by the quiet, calculated power of a phone call made with absolute certainty. No one knew who was on the other end, but they all felt, deep in their bones, that it was someone important, someone whose influence reached far beyond the walls of that courtroom. The silence grew heavier with each passing second. Every eye was fixed on the general, every ear straining to catch even a fragment of his words. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, the kind of edge that came from decades of experience, from battles fought in places far more dangerous than a courtroom. He ended his sentence with finality, as though sealing a decision, and though no one else knew what had been agreed upon, the ripple it sent through the room was undeniable. What had started as mockery was dissolving into confusion, curiosity, and unease. That single call, that small act carried out with such composure, had begun to turn the tide of the entire courtroom. The people who had laughed were now silent, the judge who had dismissed him now leaned slightly forward, and even the opposing counsel's smirk had faltered. The general's phone call was no longer just a phone call, it was a shift of power, one that no one in that room had expected to see. The moment the general lowered the phone, the air in the courtroom thickened with an intensity that no one could ignore. His movements were steady, unhurried, the kind of movements that belonged to a man who didn't need to prove himself to anyone. He slipped the phone back into his pocket with the same precision he had pulled it out, as if the call had been nothing more than routine, nothing out of the ordinary. But to everyone watching, it was anything but routine. The silence that followed stretched long, pressing on the chest of every person in the room, forcing them to face the shift they didn't yet understand. The judge, who only moments earlier had seemed dismissive, leaned back in his chair, his brows furrowing slightly. He tried to maintain his neutral expression, but the small twitch in his jaw betrayed the unease he was beginning to feel. He cleared his throat, as if to regain control of the room, but even his voice caught faintly before he spoke again. It wasn't the general who had changed, it was the perception of everyone else who realized, without fully knowing why, that something had just shifted. The opposing attorney no longer leaned back with that smug comfort. His pen, once tapping lazily on the desk in mock confidence, now sat still in his hand. His eyes flicked toward the general and away again, almost as if looking too long would give away the nervousness he was trying to hide. He didn't know what had been said, he didn't know who had been on the other end of the line, but something in the general's demeanor told him it wasn't a call he could afford to ignore. His smirk was gone, replaced with the tight-lipped expression of a man calculating possibilities he hadn't prepared for. In the gallery, the whispers began again, but this time they were sharper, shorter, filled with tension instead of amusement. No one dared laugh now. The same people who had nudged one another with jokes and sneers were sitting straighter, their eyes fixed on the man they had mocked only minutes ago. The arrogance that had fueled them was gone, replaced with the uneasy realization that they might have misjudged him entirely. It wasn't just his phone call, it was the way he carried himself after it, the calmness that told them he knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what was coming next. The bailiff, who had moved around the general earlier with casual disregard, now shifted uncomfortably at his post. He had seen countless courtroom dramas play out, had witnessed theatrics of all kinds, but there was nothing theatrical about what he had just witnessed. This wasn't a desperate act or a hollow display. This was control, quiet, unshaken control. And the bailiff felt it in a way that unsettled him. His eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting someone important to walk in at any moment, summoned by the call that had just been made. Every second of silence pressed harder on the room. People found themselves glancing at one another, searching for confirmation that they weren't the only ones feeling it. No one knew who had been on the other end of the line, but everyone knew it wasn't just anyone. It wasn't a family member, it wasn't a friend, it was someone whose name, if spoken aloud, would change the entire tone of the proceedings. And that possibility lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Even the judge, trying to move the hearing forward, spoke with a tone that carried less authority than before. He attempted to continue as though nothing had happened, but the words landed differently now. His gavel no longer felt like the loudest sound in the room. It was the silence after the call that reigned, heavy and unrelenting. The general didn't move to explain himself. He didn't offer the courtroom a clue, didn't bother to soothe their rising confusion. He sat just as he had before, posture strong, eyes steady, as if the mocking and laughter had never existed. But that silence spoke louder than any explanation could. The arrogance in the room had been replaced with an unspoken question: Who was this man, really? Opposing counsel shifted again, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of the desk now, no longer confident. The earlier smirk seemed almost ridiculous in hindsight, a foolish display in front of someone whose silence alone carried more power than the attorney's words ever could. He tried to mask his discomfort with professionalism, but his body betrayed him. The longer the general remained quiet, the more the weight of that call pressed down on everyone in the room. The gallery grew restless, but not with laughter this time. It was unease, the kind that crept into their bones. People adjusted in their seats, crossed and uncrossed their arms, glanced at the door as if expecting an interruption that never came. The tension wound tighter with every heartbeat, and no one dared to break it with careless words. They had mocked a man whose silence now left them speechless, whose phone call lingered in the room like a command they didn't hear but somehow felt. Every eye stayed fixed on him, waiting for a clue, waiting for something to ease the discomfort. But he offered nothing. He simply sat, calm and unwavering, the kind of calm that came only from someone who knew exactly how much power he truly held. And as the minutes stretched on, it became painfully clear to everyone that the general had just shifted the balance of the entire courtroom with nothing more than a single call. The courtroom had been rattled into silence by the phone call, but silence alone wasn't enough to explain the unease creeping into every corner of the room. It was what followed that began to peel back the layers, to reveal hints of the influence no one had expected. The general remained seated exactly where he had been, posture strong, face calm, but the stillness around him seemed different now. It wasn't simply the silence of a man waiting his turn, it was the silence of a man who knew he had already altered the course of the day. The first sign came in something so small that most people would have missed it. The bailiff, who had earlier moved past the general with casual disregard, straightened his stance and glanced toward the door more than once. His movements grew sharper, more deliberate, as though he sensed something was about to happen. He stopped treating the general like a background figure and instead watched him with the uneasy respect one gives to someone whose authority might outrank their own. That subtle change did not go unnoticed by the audience, and whispers began to circulate once more, this time laced with suspicion instead of mockery. Minutes ticked by, and then the sound of the courtroom door creaking open drew every eye. A man in uniform stepped inside, not just any uniform, but the kind that made the entire atmosphere shift immediately. His walk was crisp, precise, and his eyes scanned the room before landing on the general. Without hesitation, he moved closer, stopping just short of the bench, and gave a sharp nod of acknowledgement, not to the judge, not to the attorneys, but directly to the man sitting silently at the defense table. It wasn't a casual greeting, it was recognition, the kind that carried weight. The gallery, which had once been filled with laughter and smug amusement, now stirred with confusion. Who was this man they had mocked? Why would someone in uniform show him that kind of deference? Even the judge's eyes narrowed, his authority challenged in the most subtle but undeniable way. He tapped his gavel against the desk to restore order, but the crisp sound didn't carry the same confidence it had before. For the first time, the general's presence was forcing him to reconsider the assumptions he had made. The opposing counsel shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance crumbling with each passing second. He tried to lean back again, tried to recapture the smug confidence that had carried him at the start of the hearing, but his hand betrayed him as it tapped nervously against the table. He glanced between the general and the man in uniform, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Nothing in his legal training had prepared him for a courtroom where silence and presence carried more power than words. The whispers in the gallery grew louder, the confusion spreading like wildfire. Some recognized the insignia on the uniform, their voices trembling as they muttered guesses to those beside them. Others stared in silence, unable to reconcile the man they had dismissed with the reality forming before their eyes. The general still hadn't said a word, hadn't made any attempt to demand recognition, and yet recognition was being forced upon him by the respect of those who understood his true identity. It wasn't just the uniformed man's arrival, it was his behavior that made the difference. He didn't act as though he were stepping into a courtroom, he acted as though he were reporting to a superior. His nod carried acknowledgement, his posture carried respect, and his silence carried confirmation of what many were now beginning to suspect. The general wasn't a man scrambling for help. He wasn't a man on the defensive. He was a man with reach, a man with power, a man who could make one phone call and command the attention of people who others only read about in headlines. The judge cleared his throat again, trying to press forward, but his tone lacked the same edge it once had. His authority, though not outright challenged, had been quietly undermined by the shift in the room. He glanced toward the general, and though his face remained composed, there was hesitation in his eyes. For the first time, he seemed to wonder if the man sitting silently before him wasn't just another ordinary figure, but someone whose influence stretched further than the courtroom's walls. The attorney's voice cracked slightly when he spoke again, his arguments less forceful, his tone uncertain. He kept glancing at the general, as though searching for some sign of weakness, some sign that this man wasn't as powerful as the shifting atmosphere suggested. But the general gave him nothing. He remained as calm as he had been from the start, hands folded, posture unbroken, the picture of quiet authority. Every person in the room began to feel the weight of what they had missed earlier. They had mocked him, underestimated him, dismissed him, but the reality that was unfolding told a different story. This wasn't a man begging for recognition. This wasn't a man trying to prove himself. This was a man whose true influence was only beginning to show, and the small glimpses they had seen so far were enough to rattle the confidence of everyone present. The whispers in the gallery faded into uneasy silence again, but the silence was no longer rooted in arrogance. It was rooted in fear, in awe, in the dawning understanding that the general's reach went far beyond what any of them had imagined. And though they didn't yet know the full extent of his power, they knew enough to realize they had gravely underestimated him. The tension that had gripped the courtroom after the phone call and the arrival of the uniformed officer didn't dissolve quickly, it lingered like a storm cloud. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the atmosphere began to shift again. The fear and confusion that had silenced the mockery started to give way to something heavier, something more humbling. Respect, unspoken yet undeniable, began to take the place of arrogance. It started with the people in the gallery. The same spectators who had smirked, whispered, and laughed earlier now sat in uneasy quiet, their eyes glued to the general. They no longer saw him as the lonely figure sitting at a table, they saw him as a man whose silence had carried more weight than all their noise combined. The whispers of ridicule were gone, replaced by hushed tones of recognition. Some leaned toward one another, their voices shaky as they tried to put into words the realization dawning on them, but even those whispers quickly faded, because no one wanted to be caught speaking out of turn in his presence anymore. The bailiff, who had at first treated the general as just another ordinary man, now moved with a carefulness that hadn't been there before. His posture stiffened each time he passed near him, and his eyes avoided direct contact. It wasn't avoidance born from arrogance this time, it was the kind of avoidance born from awareness, the knowledge that he was standing too close to someone whose authority outstripped his own. Where earlier there had been indifference, now there was caution, even reverence. The judge, too, could no longer maintain the casual dismissiveness he had displayed. Each time his gaze met the general's, his expression tightened. His gavel strikes, which once rang out with commanding authority, now sounded more like attempts to reassert control he wasn't certain he still held. His words came slower, his tone measured, careful in a way that betrayed the shift in power. For the first time, the judge seemed aware that he was not the most powerful man in the room. Opposing counsel had abandoned all traces of smugness. His earlier confidence had eroded completely, leaving behind only the nervous professionalism of someone who realized he was outmatched. He tried to continue with his arguments, but his voice betrayed him, cracking slightly, faltering under the weight of the silence that followed each sentence. His eyes darted to the general again and again, searching for any sign of weakness but finding none. The very presence of the man he had mocked now unsettled him so deeply that even his well-rehearsed lines felt flimsy and hollow. The shift in the room wasn't just in behavior, it was in energy. Where laughter and arrogance had once filled the air, there was now an almost reverent silence. Every person in the room felt it, though few could articulate why. They had not seen the general raise his voice. They had not seen him throw his weight around or demand recognition. They had only seen a calm man make a single phone call and then sit back in silence, unshaken. Yet somehow, that was enough to unravel their certainty and command their respect. The uniformed officer who had entered remained standing nearby, his posture never faltering, his presence serving as a constant reminder of the general's reach. The nod he had given earlier still echoed in everyone's minds, a gesture of deference that revealed more about the general's identity than words ever could. That small, undeniable acknowledgement from one man in uniform was enough to ripple through the room, forcing everyone else to reevaluate who they were in the presence of. Even the most skeptical spectators, those who had laughed the loudest earlier, sat with bowed heads now, unwilling to meet his gaze. They might not have known his full story, but they understood enough. He wasn't someone to ridicule. He wasn't someone to dismiss. He was someone whose presence commanded respect, someone who had earned it long before stepping into that courtroom. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with unspoken recognition, with the weight of the truth pressing down on everyone. Respect replaced arrogance in the way people sat straighter, in the way voices quieted, in the way no one dared to make a careless move. The general hadn't forced it, hadn't demanded it, he had simply let the truth of who he was reveal itself, piece by piece, until no one could deny it. The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, but even as he spoke, his tone carried a trace of deference. The attorney shuffled his papers nervously, his earlier bravado gone. The gallery shifted in their seats, no longer restless, but subdued, as though they understood they were no longer watching an ordinary proceeding, they were witnessing something far greater. The general sat unmoved through it all, the same calm, silent figure he had been from the beginning. Yet now, no one saw him the way they had at first. Every person in the room, from the judge to the bailiff to the spectators in the back, felt the undeniable truth: respect had replaced ridicule, and silence had turned into reverence.